Good afternoon, dear colleagues. I'm happy to welcome here all media representatives and our distinguished guests and experts and participants of the video bridge. We are starting our virtual roundtable on the European Union at the threshold of reforms, and we are summing up the results of the EU summit which took place last week on the 18th and 19th of February. At this summit, Great Britain got special conditions for the membership in the European Union. Great Britain will never be a part of a European superpower and will never join the Eurozone. It will keep the necessary protective measures for its economy. It will be able to stop the payment of migrant payments if it proves that the load on the budget is too excessive. Now the European Union is on the threshold of reforms, and Great Britain is about to do a referendum which will take place on the 23rd of June. And together with our guests, we are going to speak about what's in for the European Union and what are the challenges faced by it. And of course, we will talk about the Russian-British relationship in the context of the threats faced by Europe and the world today. I introduce our distinguished guest. In London, we have Marcus Papadopoulos, Editor-in-Chief of Politics First, and in Moscow, we have the Assistant Professor of the Moscow State Institute of International Relations under the Ministry of International Relations of Russia, Nikolai Topornin. I would like to start with our distinguished guest in London. Let's start with the historical solution for Great Britain, which was announced at the EU summit. The country will have a special status, but even before that, Great Britain had a special status in the European Union. It wasn't part of the Eurozone, wasn't part of the Schengen zone. Mr. Papadopoulos, why is it now that there is the acute problem of Great Britain's membership in the EU? What do the British want and why?
I think it's really important to state this, that David Cameron promised a referendum on the EU on the basis that he did not think he would win last May's general election in Britain. He did not think he would be re-elected as Prime Minister. So it really says a lot about David Cameron's own personal leadership that he would promise a referendum on probably the most controversial political issue on Britain, but he promised it believing that he'd never have to fulfill it, because he did not believe at last May's general election he would be re-elected as Prime Minister of Britain. So I think that's very important to state, and it also, as I said, says a lot about David Cameron's own leadership. But for Britain and the EU referendum, well, Britain's relationship with the European Union is so extraordinarily complex, and a lot of that has to do with the British mindset, or what I should really say, the English mindset, because in Scotland most people have a very favourable opinion towards the European Union, but in England, in particular what's known as Middle England, in the south of England, they have quite an antagonistic attitude towards Europe. So many people in the south of England do not regard themselves as being European. They do not regard Britain as being part of Europe, and they believe that any relationship Britain has with the European Union has to be one of a special relationship. So that makes it very complex from the outset. Now, what does Britain want from the European Union? Well, of course, some people in the British Parliament who are pro-EU believe that Britain should be a member of the EU, but Britain needs to have a special status, i.e. Britain will never be part of a European army, will never be part of the Eurozone, will never have a single foreign policy. But therein lies quite a big problem, because if you join a club, if you're a member of a club, you accept the rules of the club. And Britain tries to straddle a very difficult relationship. It tries to be in the European Union, but then it tries to be with America. as well. And of course, it's fairly well known in Britain that America views Britain as being its eyes and ears of in the European Union, which of course can be very dangerous. As we saw in regard to the sanctions on Russia, many countries in the European Union, notably Germany, were reluctant to place sanctions on Russia. But through British influence in the European Union, the Americans were able to force the EU as a whole to place sanctions on Russia. So the point is this, is that Britain can't have its own way. It either accepts the fundamental pillars of the European Union. If it doesn't accept it, then it really should not be a member. And you know, one of the fundamental pillars is the freedom of movement of workers across the European Union. Now, whether you like that or not, that is a fundamental pillar of the EU, and David Cameron did not get the renegotiation that he wanted on that. I mean, we hear about a 7-year period where migrants coming to Britain can't claim on welfare. But 7 years is a very small period of time, and what happens after 7 years? So, in short, it's an exceptionally complex situation, and it's not helped by the fact that many people in the British Parliament and many British commentators in the British mainstream press are approaching the debate from what I would call a jingoistic perspective. There's references to how Britain staved off Napoleon, staved off the Kaiser, staved off Hitler, and now we will stave off the European Union. Now, it is very immature, it is very unintelligent, but that's the reality of much of the debate in England, not Britain, in England at the moment.
Спасибо, господин.
Thank you, Mr. Papadopoulos. Another very short question. The other day, the British newspaper Times announced a public poll, an opinion poll, whether the British should stay in or out of the EU. And it turned out that 38% of the respondents said that the British should leave the EU. And about 40% said that they are against leaving. And this picture changed a bit since February. In February, there were much more proponents of the out than an in. So from your opinion, what are the disadvantages for the UK of leaving the EU?
First of all, I would say, don't place too much significance on opinion polls, and especially opinion polls in Britain, because there's an opinion poll today published in the Daily Telegraph which states that most people would want to leave the European Union. And then, of course, the opinion polls leading up to the general election in Britain last May stated that there's going to be a hung parliament. So opinion polls in Britain are historically quite dubious. But, you know, if Britain was to leave the European Union, what would be the disadvantages? Well, Britain, when it exports to the European Union, it doesn't pay export duties. It doesn't pay any sort of tariffs. Britain has a special privilege in regard to access to technology within the European Union, towards natural resources within the European Union. Those sort of privileges that Britain would never have if it was outside the European Union. And then also, there's another point to be made which isn't really being discussed about at the House of Commons at the moment. Now, there are about 2 million Britons living and working abroad within the European Union. Now, hypothetically speaking, if Britain was to leave the European Union, what would be the status of those 2 million Britons? Would they remain in Spain? Would they remain in France? Would they remain in Germany? Would they remain in Poland? If, hypothetically speaking, they said, we need to come back to Britain, can Britain seriously, and from a practical point of view, be able to accommodate 2 million people? Could the National Health Service accommodate 2 million people just like that? Could the schools in Britain accommodate 2 million people just like that? Could the welfare state accommodate 2 million people just like that? I think the answer, without a doubt, is a resounding no. So if Britain was to leave the European Union, that wouldn't be the end of the story, because you've got 2 million British people elsewhere in the European Union. There would be a question mark over their status. If they all came back to Britain, could the National Health Service cope with it? I think that's very, very difficult to say that it would. And the National Health Service is under so much pressure at the moment, it could be the drop in the cup which causes the cup to overflow. Perhaps the NHS could collapse if Britain left the European Union and had 2 million British people come back to live in the UK.
Господин Papadopoulos.
Mr. Papadopoulos, but if Great Britain still leaves the European Union, Scotland might also initiate another referendum on leaving Great Britain. Does this possibility scare the leadership of Great Britain?
I think that the political establishment in Britain now understands and accepts that Scotland will become an independent country. Sooner or later, it will become independent. Why? Well, even though 2 years ago there was a referendum in Scotland and people voted to stay within the EU, within Britain, they voted because they were fearful that Scotland would not be able to survive economically. However, that was 2 years ago. Going into the general election last year, David Cameron, the Conservative Party, played a devastating card, which ultimately resulted in David Cameron winning the election. And the card was this: the fear that the Conservative Party put out in Britain, in particular Middle England, which is the crucial part. If you want to form the government in Britain, you have to win Middle England. And the fear was that there would be a Labour Scottish National Party coalition. And ultimately, that fear is what won the election for David Cameron. Now, that was racist towards Scottish people, and historians in the future will judge David Cameron as being the person who put the nail in the coffin of the United Kingdom, because Scotland sooner or later will become independent. However, that independence could be sped up if Britain votes to leave the European Union, because Scotland overwhelmingly are pro-European Union, and Scotland have a far more progressive attitude to foreign relations than many people do in England. So I think the British political establishment understands that Scotland sooner or later will become independent, and that it could be a lot earlier if Britain votes to leave the EU. But I would add this one final point. The Falkland Islands, which are Britain's overseas territories, are being ignored in this debate at the moment in Britain. Now, the Falkland Islands, the people there are overwhelmingly pro-European Union. Why? Because they receive so many economic subsidies from the European Union for their agriculture, for their tourism. Now, many people in the Conservative Party in Britain, they're fiercely proud of the Falklands, and they say they will never be a part of Argentina. But they're either ignorant or they don't want to face up to the reality that the people in the Falkland Islands are pro-European Union. There's about 3,500 people that live in the Falkland Islands, and they all have a very positive EU stance towards the EU. But no one's talking about that in Westminster, because, as I say, it's either through ignorance or it's uncomfortable if you're anti-EU to talk about the Falklands, because the Falklands are so pro-EU. So my point is this: if Britain was to vote to leave the EU, Scotland could sooner or later become independent. But how would the Falkland Islands respond? They would get no more subsidies, economic subsidies from the European Union. Britain would have to, in theory, start providing those subsidies. But then the British economy is in such a precarious condition. Could Britain afford that? So then the focus, or the ball, is back in the court of the Falkland Islands. How would the Falkland Islands respond to Britain leaving the EU? I'm not saying that they would vote to become independent, but the Falkland Islands would have to start looking elsewhere for economic assistance. And of course, the country that's closest to the Falkland Islands geographically is Argentina. So if Britain voted to leave the EU, could that, as a consequence, an unintended consequence, create a better relationship between the Falkland Islands and Argentina?
Да, спасибо большое.
Thank you very much for this interesting comment. It's very difficult to build this logical chain and to decide whether to be or not to be within the European Union. That's up to the British to decide at the referendum. But why does the European Union want to keep Great Britain within? Do you think that the summit in Brussels will create a dangerous precedent in other countries? Because it's not fair. One country gets some special treatment, others don't. What if certain process will start where each country within the EU will require special conditions, just like Britain? What do you think? Thank you very much. Does the mic work? Good afternoon, dear colleagues, dear friends. My best wishes to Marcus Papadopoulos in London. It was very interesting for me to listen to his opinion regarding the membership of Great Britain in the EU and the discussions which currently take place in London and the political establishment of Great Britain. Indeed, the problem of the status of Great Britain within the EU keeps attracting everybody's attention. And of course this troubles Brussels. Why? Because the economy of the European Union is based on three pillars. That's the German economy, the French economy, and the British economy. And if it so happens that the British vote for leaving the EU at the referendum, then the European Union will suffer great losses economically and politically. Many experts believe that if Malta put forward such conditions, or another small country like Bulgaria, then there would be no serious and heated debates like this. We all remember that when there was the big EU summit in Brussels on the 18th and 19th of February, the leaders kept negotiating till 3 o'clock in the morning, and there were meetings within the format of all 28 countries of the EU. There were bilateral meetings, which means that Brussels thinks that the membership of Great Britain in the EU is very important. Now there is another issue. What can happen? Recently, I talked on the internet, online, with my colleagues who are from Switzerland, and they said that in principle, Great Britain has the possibility to cooperate with the European Union like Switzerland, even if it leaves the EU. If at the referendum on the 23rd of June, the British will vote out, that doesn't mean the end of life. This doesn't mean the establishment of a different economic and political situation. In Lisbon, anyway, according to the Lisbon Treaty, there is a 2-year break before the country leaves the EU. And then there is the model tested in Switzerland. As we know, Switzerland is not a member of the EU. If I'm not mistaken, in 1992 there was a referendum in Switzerland regarding access to the EU, and we all know that most Swiss citizens said that Switzerland should not be part of the EU. Nevertheless, over those years, maybe since the late 1990s, over the past 20 years, Switzerland became much closer to the EU economically. First, more than 120 economic, social, and infrastructural agreements were struck, and Switzerland integrated into the single economic space. Yes, Switzerland is not part of the Eurozone, and it will probably not happen in the near future, because the Swiss, like the British, like the English, are proud of their national currency. They are proud of the Swiss franc, which is actually one of the few convertible European currencies. Yes, the Swiss don't want to become part of a political process. They don't want Brussels to take decisions instead of them, even partially, because we understand that being part of the EU means that part of the political and economic sovereignty should be given away to Brussels, and the Swiss people don't want that. On the other hand, Switzerland signed the Schengen Agreement and became part of the Schengen zone, and that's important as well. And the situation today confirms that Switzerland cooperates very efficiently with the European Union in this status. Another example is Norway. Here we have a very similar situation. This country is not part of the EU, but nevertheless, it still signed an agreement on free trade zone. It also signed a Schengen zone agreement, and it interacts economically actively. So, in my opinion, there is no tragedy for Great Britain. I think it's the European Union that will lose more, because it will be deprived of important political support of Great Britain in the European Union. Because when there is this triumvirate, London, Paris, Brussels, the authority, weight, and economic power of the European Union becomes greater in the international arena. If London wants to quit, then the EU will have to change. And I also understand my colleagues in Paris and in Brussels who say it's like enfant terrible. We cannot get troubled with this child anymore. For example, Great Britain really bargained and insisted on special conditions recently when there was a recalculation of economic indicators, and it turned out that Great Britain had to pay another 2 billion euros to the EU budget. And David Cameron didn't understand that, didn't agree with that, as well as the British political establishment. He said, why do we have to pay extra all the time? Of course, no one wants to pay anything extra. No single country has extra money. But in other countries, such as Germany or France, they do not disagree so radically with such financial conditions. And Great Britain took this position frequently. Sometimes it's very critical of some EU decisions. So, of course, this is a very serious issue. And if the British vote for out, This will cause a serious restructuring within the EU. As you said, 2 million British people work outside Great Britain. But once again, there are millions of migrants from Eastern Europe working in Great Britain. Those are migrants from Bulgaria, Romania, Poland, the Baltic countries, and the question arises what to do with them, what the consequences are going to be with them. And in my opinion, there will be losses both on the part of Great Britain and the European Union. No one will emerge as a winner after that. And of course, this will require tremendous effort on the part of the EU leaders to minimize these political, social, and economic problems that will arise if the British people vote for leaving the EU. So before the 23rd of June, we will have a very interesting situation when public opinion polls will show some differences, but we can say that no single party, either for in or out, has a big advantage. So everything depends on the campaigns for in and for out, for and against the membership. Much will depend on those political campaigns, and then we will see who will decide the opinion of the British. Thank you very much, Nikolai. The European Union will have to restructure if Britain leaves it, but it will also have to restructure even if Britain remains in. The European Union is in for a reform. First, there are some conditions required by Great Britain, and there's another point which shows that the European Union really requires a reform. During the summit in Brussels, the migration crisis was one of the topics, but because the Turkish Prime Minister didn't come to the summit, this topic, there was no such great topic or focus on this topic. And we know that the British Prime Minister also set forward some conditions. Not all of those conditions were accepted. Mr. Papadopoulos, there is a question to you once again. From your point of view, the Europeans, do they think that only Turkey is capable of stopping the flow of migrants to Europe? Because the appetites of Turkey keep growing, and in mid-March, another extraordinary summit of the European Union should take place with the participation of Turkey. And what do you think? How should the European Union reform in order to cope with those migration problems? We are now having some broader topics for discussion, and it's not just about Britain leaving or staying within the EU. The floor is yours.
Case that numerous people in Brussels believe that Turkey is either unwilling or incapable, or perhaps both, of stopping the huge amounts of refugees which are entering the European Union. But the same people also believe that Greece is not doing enough to secure the European Union in the Mediterranean from refugees. But you know something? There's a far bigger picture to the migrant crisis engulfing the European Union. And the far bigger picture is this. The European Union has played an integral role in creating the migrant crisis. Now, why do I say that? The European Union is an integral part of the West. And the European Union supported military intervention in Libya in 2011. The European Union has been giving political support. I would also add as well covert support to various Islamist terrorist groups inside Syria, because the West as a whole, the West led by the United States, and then with its junior partner Britain, and then the European Union as a whole, is seeking to cement Western global dominance from a political perspective and from an economic perspective. So the European Union, in effect, has brought this crisis on itself. And the countries inside the European Union that have been leading the way in military intervention, in interference in other countries abroad, in other countries, has been, without a doubt, Britain, and then followed by France. Now, if we have a look prior to British and French intervention in Libya in 2011, how many migrants were leaving Libya and sub-Saharan Africa to come to the European Union? Well, a negligible figure compared to how many are coming today. Prior to Britain and France and the European Union as a whole interfering in the affairs of Syria in order to overthrow the Syrian government, to destroy the Syrian state, which would end Russian power and influence in the Middle East, which would end Iranian power and influence in the Middle East. How many people were leaving Syria prior to Western intervention? How many people were leaving Syria and coming to the European Union? Once again, a negligible figure in comparison to how many are leaving today. So Britain and the European Union as a whole can talk about the migrant crisis. They can talk about how it's exposing Schengen for being, quote, a worthless agreement, for being, quote, a dangerous agreement. But the reality is that no one in the European Union is tackling the roots of the migrant crisis. And the roots of the migrant crisis is the European Union going hand in hand with the United States in interfering in the affairs of independent sovereign countries. The migrant crisis has been brought on to the European Union by its behaviour in Libya, by its behaviour in Syria, and that behaviour is not changing. And very, very few people at the British in the British Parliament, in the House of Commons, very few people in British mainstream media are highlighting the real cause of the migrant crisis. And people in England, and I emphasise England, are saying how the migrant crisis demonstrates how dangerous the European Union is. Well, as I said, there's a far bigger picture, because the British government, led by David Cameron, has played an instrumental role in bringing the migrant crisis on to northern Europe. And of course, a lot of these refugees from Libya, from Syria, from Iraq, from sub-Saharan Africa, they will eventually come into Britain. And the problem is that English people will say that's a danger of the European Union. Well, actually, it's not. It's a reflection of how the Americans, the European Union, and Britain, being that bridge between America and the European Union, plays such a malignant role in international affairs. People in Britain need to understand that the terrorist threat from ISIS to British cities, for example, from London, in London, has been brought on by the British government's support of Islamist terrorist groups in Libya in 2011 against Colonel Gaddafi, and Britain's support for Islamist terrorist groups in Syria to overthrow the Syrian government. So we can look at the refugee crisis affecting Europe on its own, but quite frankly, that's a futile thing to do, because there's a far bigger picture, and the roots are the West and its belief in itself, its messianic view of itself as having the right to interfere in the affairs of countries, and then all hell breaks loose, and no one wants to take responsibility for what they've done in the West.
Господин Пападопoulos, еще один уточнение.
Mr. Papadopoulos, another question. At the beginning, you mentioned that the European Union inflicted this migration crisis on itself by supporting Islamist groups, and the same concerns Britain. Some experts believe that the position of Great Britain in Muslim countries is still very important, and even though this is not talked about, the British special forces are behind the establishment such groups like Brothers Muslims. So why do you think the Great Britain doesn't use its influence today in order to change the situation in this risky region so as to prevent the risks for Great Britain and the EU as a whole? You've mentioned the terrorist threat against British cities, among other things.
That's a very interesting question. But I would answer it in short by saying, if you play with fire, you get burnt. And Britain, for example, America also, but you've asked a question about Britain. Britain has a long history of working with Islamist groups in order to achieve geostrategic objectives. So we can have a look to Afghanistan in the 1980s. The Conservative government of Britain, under the leadership of Margaret Thatcher, were one of the biggest supporters, after America and Saudi Arabia, were one of the biggest supporters to the Mujahideen, who were fighting the Russians. Now, that was a short-term, reckless foreign policy discussion, because all Britain wanted in the 1980s was to defeat the Soviet army. But they didn't think about who they were getting in bed with to do that. And then, in Bosnia, in the civil war in Bosnia in the 1990s, Britain, along with America, facilitated the arrival of Mujahideen fighters who had fought the Russians in Afghanistan. Britain and America facilitated the arrival of Mujahideen fighters into Bosnia to fight the Bosnian Serbs, because Britain's position was that that Yugoslavia had no future, that Yugoslavia was a centrally planned economy, it was a socialist country, and it had no place in the new Europe. And they knew the Serbs obviously wanted to defend Yugoslavia. So the British were supporting Islamic extremists in the Balkans, in Europe itself. And of course, we know that bin Laden visited Sarajevo at the beginning of 1994, and he was given a Bosnian passport. So even in the 1990s, Islamists had a foothold in Europe. And then we can turn to, as I said earlier on, we can turn to Libya, where Britain was supporting Islamist terrorist groups to overthrow Colonel Gaddafi, which meant that Russian influence and power in North Africa would be severely restricted. And it was also about gaining access to Libya's oil market. And then in Syria, Syria's the big one, Britain has played a leading role, I emphasize a leading role, in destabilizing Syria, because the objective of Britain and the West as a whole is to overthrow the Syrian government. Britain knows quite well that Syria and Russia are long-standing friends and allies, and Britain wants to, along with America, end Russian influence in the Middle East. It wants to take away Israel's number one enemy in the Middle East in terms of an Arab country, which is Syria. So you ask me about why can't Britain use its influence with these Islamist groups to prevent them from being a threat to Britain. If you get into bed with extremists, these extremists will use you. They will take from you what they want, and then sooner or later they will turn their guns on you. But Britain does not learn from the past. It does not learn that the terrible, terrible terrorist threat posed to ordinary people, for example, in London, is a result of its foreign policy. And also, Britain has an extremely close strategic relationship with Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia is the leading exporter of Islamic extremism and Islamic terrorism to the world. In numerous mosques in Britain, you can find Saudi Wahhabist literature, you can find Saudi Wahhabist sermons, and they are all calling for non-Muslims to be persecuted, for Jews to be killed, for homosexuals to be killed, for Britain to become an Islamic country. But the British government, quite frankly, doesn't care about that because they pursue a very beneficial economic relationship with Saudi Arabia. So, for example, a lot of the bombs that the Saudi Air Force is dropping on civilians in Yemen have come from Britain. A lot of the planes that the Saudi Air Force are using to attack civilians in Yemen have been provided for by BAE Systems, Britain's largest aviation company. So not only does Britain play with fire in regard to Islamist terrorist groups in Libya, in Syria, but also it has a close friendship with, as I said, in my opinion, the heart of Islamic extremism in the world, and it's Saudi Arabia. But then, you know, the British establishment live in a different world compared to most British people. Their world is not the world of the ordinary person. Coming here today, I used public transport, so I was in danger, potentially, of being a victim of an Islamist terrorist attack. But members of the British establishment who work with Islamic terrorists, who are close to Saudi Arabia, they don't have to use the transport system. They don't have to worry about that sort of threat. So the world of the British establishment is very different to the world of the ordinary British citizen. But to come back to sort of conclude on my answer, Britain has opened a Pandora's box along with America and the European Union as a whole, and you cannot put the lid back on that Pandora's box. And the people, the terrorists that Britain has been supporting, there's no way that they're going to stop in posing a threat to Britain, because they have their own long-term objectives and they want to bring Islamism to the towns and cities of Britain. So the answer is this, is that once you open the lid on the Pandora's box, you can't close it. Britain is responsible for that. And the sad reality is that very, very few people at the British Parliament and very few British commentators will even acknowledge that that needs to be discussed, because the view is that the crisis in Syria is a result of the Syrian government and is a result of Russia. Now, how can you ever resolve a problem if you won't have an analytical look at the roots of the problem? It's ludicrous, but even more than ludicrous, it's extremely dangerous to the security and the well-being of the ordinary British man and woman in Britain today.
Благодарю вас, господин Пападопoulos.
Thank you, Mr. Papadopoulos. Nikolai, once again, a question to you. As our British guest said, Pandora's box is open and we need regulation in the European Union. So the policy of the European Union's migration policy and the European Union as a whole, do they need reform? And in your opinion, what should the EU do in order to resolve this complicated problem? Should it pay money to Turkey, 3 billion euros, as Merkel promised to Erdogan, but now Turkey's appetites keep growing. Mr. Papadopoulos mentioned that some experts believe that Turkey doesn't do enough, but Turkey is not the richest country of the EU, and many migrants just use it in order to move on to richer countries. So maybe it's not just the problem of Greece, but it's the problem of the EU. Maybe it should be Greece to which we should pay the money, not to Turkey. Thank you for your question. It's very interesting. It's very big. And recently, this question has been raised at almost all the platforms. I think it's very difficult to answer it because EU leaders have been trying to resolve this issue for a year. The issue of uncontrollable flow of migrants. But nevertheless, there are some points that I would like to emphasize. First of all, in my opinion, the European Union, and I have been dealing with the law of the European Union for 20 years, I came to a conclusion that the migration law is outdated. It's very much outdated. I can give you the example of the Dublin Agreement of 1999, which today is a core document regulating migration issues. But the point of the Dublin Agreement boils down to the fact that if refugees arrived at a certain country, it's this country that should deal with the migration problem. In today's realities, it turns out that now that most migrants, about 1 million of them, came to Greece, it means that it's the Greek government that should deal with their problems, that should help them to settle and so on. Obviously, migrants do not want to remain in Greece. Their main goal is to move on to the center of Europe, to Germany, if possible to France, to Scandinavian countries, and they even tried to penetrate into Great Britain via the famous undersea tunnel. So that's one point. The European law needs to be reviewed. The second point, which is also linked to the migration law, is the issue of social migration standards. Because it was for a reason that migrants want to go to Germany. They also want to go to Austria, Sweden, Denmark, Great Britain, France, because there used to be very favorable social conditions for refugees and migrants. They got a roof under their head, above their heads. They got good benefits. Their children went to schools and kindergartens. They got high-quality medical services. So what they got could not be compared with what they could have in their countries, in their home countries. And I can see an even more important problem here. Until recently, refugees got just about 600 euros just for the pocket money. All the rest was paid by the social structures, the social services in Germany. That's a second point. The third point, and I'm going away from the migrant crisis today. I'm talking about the theoretical level. The third point is, of course, the problem of the external borders. Because in 2015, we saw that the external border of the EU is transparent. We know that according to the Schengen Agreement, it's the internal borders that should be transparent, the borders between the Schengen zone members, and they are transparent. It's a unique achievement of the European Union. 26 countries have dismantled their internal borders. But, based on the Schengen Agreement again, no one removed responsibility from the member states to keep the external borders non-transparent. We know that right now the EU does not have a single border service. There are no quick response forces that could promptly resolve certain acute problems, which is why the main goal, the goal of controlling external borders, is something that external states have to deal with. And it was proven that Greek patrol, the Greek forces, and maybe even the Greek army proved to be non-capable of controlling the border effectively. I'm not talking about closing the borders, but they couldn't control effectively this sea border. And it so happened that every day up to 2,000, 3,000 or 4,000 people came by boats to the Greek islands and said that they wanted to be refugees. So that's a problem. And those three aspects together, the migration law, the differences in the social system of the member states, the fact that the external border of the EU was not controllable, all of this resulted in the fact that refugees who thought that they were privileged, that they could use this opportunity to penetrate into the territory of the EU to use the social benefits, they started doing this. They went that way. We know that the EU is quite tolerant towards refugees because all the EU countries are those who signed the well-known UN Convention about refugees, about providing assistance to war victims. And I think the EU has the right approach. We need to help people who are in a difficult situation. And every year the European Union accepted about 300,000 refugees and migrants. And the social and economic structure could actually cope with that flow of migrants. There was the money, there were volunteers, there were social services who coped with it. And each country accepted a certain number of refugees, mostly Germany and France. But when there was more than 1 million of refugees, and it turned out that the situation would not stop, it proved to be an excessive burden on various structures of EU members. Which is why we can see that many countries started to close their borders. Temporarily, they quit the Schengen zone, such as Greece, Austria. Denmark, Austria actually said that it will not accept more than 80 people per day. It will not accept more refugees, even in violation of existing treaties. And Macedonia, even though it's not a member of the EU, is also closing its borders because it's a neighbor to Croatia. So we can see a process which starts to spread around the EU. And this is an unpleasant process because Schengen achievements are probably the main success, the main achievement, because this is what people living in the Schengen zone can feel. And even for non-EU citizens, even for Russians, this is a convenient scheme because Russians don't have to get visas to each separate country of the EU. It's enough to get a Schengen visa. Because Russia and Great Britain have some difficulties here. Great Britain is not part of the Schengen zone, which is why Russians should get a visa to Great Britain. And it's not as easy as they might think in Great Britain, in London. Right now, the leadership of the EU is concerned, and we know that on the 7th of March, another summit of the EU with Turkey will be held. The European Union hopes, maybe without grounds, that Turkey will apply the necessary effort to keep this flow of migrants within. And the European Union offers a compensation, 3 billion euros, in order to build the camps and settlements for the refugees who already live in Turkey. We need to accept that Turkey is under stress. It's a significant burden, and of course, Turkey would like to get this money. But the other question is how much money Turkey needs in order to resolve the problem. But the Prime Minister of Turkey has already said that 3 billion is not enough. It needs 5 or more, or maybe 10 billion, and it's a non-ending story. They will ask for more and more, but on the other hand, the European Union would like to know what Turkey will actually do to stop this migrant flow, because it's well known that there are a lot of smugglers in Turkey who gain millions of euros and dollars on transporting poor people from military zones to Europe. And it's a very serious problem. By now, the European Union hasn't seen any efficient policy offered by Turkey to stop this migrant flow. We will see what will happen, but as I said at the beginning of my presentation, I said that I would not be talking about the main problem, and the main problem is the civil war in Syria, because the overwhelming majority of migrants are Syrians. There are no precise statistics, but Frontex and other services say that it's about 70% of the people who come to Europe, that they are Syrians. So in order to radically decrease the flow of refugees, they need to settle, to resolve the crisis in Syria. They need to stop the civil war. And it's the main problem from the humanitarian point of view as well, because thousands of innocent people, of ordinary people, children and old men suffer. And people who run from there live in very difficult conditions. It's the need that makes them undertake this long and dangerous way. We already know that thousands of people died while going from Turkey to Greece. It's also a humanitarian problem and catastrophe, if you want. So now, in my opinion, the actions of the European Union aimed at reinforcing the external borders and at demanding that Turkey provides a more effective control, those efforts need to be focused on resolving the situation in Syria. Without resolving the Syrian issue, in my opinion, it is impossible to radically change the situation with the inflow of migrants to the EU. Thank you very much. I would like to use the Russian expert's last phrase regarding the need to resolve the Syrian crisis. And this is the question that I would like to ask Mr. Papadopoulos. One of these days, the Russian and American presidents reached an agreement regarding the truce in Syria. I would like you to assess this agreement from your point of view and to say how this agreement was seen by the political establishment in Great Britain. You have the floor.
So 100% agree with what Nikolai said, that in order to resolve the migrant crisis affecting Europe, you have to end the dreadful conflict in Syria. I agree with Nikolai 100% with that. You know, In regard to the possible truce in Syria, well, of course, everyone wants to see peace in Syria, but we have to be realistic. If we talk about Turkey's role in stemming the flow of migrants, Syrian refugees, into Europe, well, you're asking a country which has played a cardinal role in creating the refugee crisis. It is Turkey which facilitated the arrival in Syria of Islamist fighters and jihadists in order to fight the Syrian government. If Turkey closes its border with Syria overnight, if it prevents Islamist fighters, jihadists, weapons, resources, etc., going to terrorists in Syria, then that would be a big, big step in the right direction to ending the conflict in Syria. But of course, as the Russian government has said recently, Turkey is not doing that, and by the evidence that the Russian government has presented, Turkey is continuing to support Islamist terrorists in Syria. So how can you possibly have a truce when one of the biggest players in the Syrian conflict, i.e. Turkey, is continuing to support terrorists in Syria? Now, in regard to the ceasefire talks about Syria between Russia and America, I think it's becoming obvious to a lot of people that there is, in fact, a military solution in Syria. In the last year, 2 years ago, people were saying there is no military solution. Well, I was saying a year, 2 years ago that I do believe there's a military solution, and I still say that today, that in my opinion, the only way to solve the crisis in Syria is for countries at the United Nations to offer its full support to the Syrian military and to the Russian military in their heroic and extremely successful campaign against all the terrorist groups in Syria. We know that the West and its regional allies, Turkey, Saudi Arabia and Qatar, are not going to stop supporting terrorists in Syria. We know they're going to keep on giving them weapons. We know they're going to continue giving them logistical information. We know they're going to continue giving them money. We know that Turkey will continue to buy oil from ISIS. And so any talk of a truce really doesn't make any sense when the people who have created the inferno in Syria and are continuing to pour petrol on the inferno in Syria are not going to stop doing that. So while the idea of a ceasefire sounds very attractive, in my opinion, the reality is that it's not going to work because the West and its regional allies are keeping to their policy, to their objective of overthrowing the Syrian government. It's a game of chess the West is playing. The West knows, and its regional allies know, that if you overthrow the Syrian government, if you destroy the Syrian state, if you put a pro-Western regime in Damascus, Russia's power and influence in the Middle East is over. Iran's power and influence in the Middle East is over. Israel loses its most formidable enemy, and the West and its regional allies will be extremely happy. So the West and its regional allies are keeping to their objective in supporting terrorists in Syria. And so the chances of a ceasefire being effective are extremely unlikely. Sure, there might be a ceasefire for 48 hours, 72 hours, a week, but it's not going to be successful. And even the Kurds, the YPG in northern Syria, who are fighting a formidable war against ISIS, they're being attacked, literally attacked by the Turkish military. And who is saying anything about that in Washington or London? Also this week, the British government has expressed serious concern that the YPG is working in coordination with the Syrian military and the Russian military. Why should that be of concern to Britain? The Kurds are fiercely anti-ISIS, they're fiercely anti-Islamist terrorists. Why should they not work with the Syrian military and the Russian military to eliminate this terrible malignant cancer which the West and its regional allies have created in Syria? So the British government have made it very clear that they do not like how the Kurds are working with Russia, or with the Russian government and the Syrian government. And that says a lot about Britain's policy. Britain is not going to stop its policy of seeking the overthrow of the Syrian government, and Britain is not going to stop supporting these, quite candidly, terrorist groups in Syria. So, in my opinion, the way you resolve the Syrian conflict in practice, in the world of reality, is through the Syrian and Russian militaries and the Iranian military continuing with their very effective campaign. And sure, it's not going to happen overnight, but the Syrian army, which is the heart and soul in the fight against ISIS and all the other terrorist groups in Syria, is slowly starting to liberate Syrian territory, Syrian land, from terrorists. And the Russian president, Vladimir Putin, and the Russian Foreign Minister, Sergei Lavrov, have now made it very clear that the Russian campaign will continue until terrorism is defeated. So diplomats in Russia and America can talk about a truce. The reality is that it's only going to be decided on the ground, and that is through the destruction of ISIS, of al-Nusra, and the other Islamist terrorist groups, many of which form the so-called Free Syrian Army. So that's the way the crisis in Syria is going to be resolved. I'm sorry to say that no one wants war, no one wants people to die, but the West and its regional allies are not stopping with their support. So it's down to the Syrian military and the Russian military and the Iranian military to defeat ISIS on the battlefield in Syria. That's the way you end the crisis in Syria. That's the way you will end the migrant crisis affecting Europe, because as Nikolai said, 70% or approximately 70% of the refugees are from Syria. So you destroy the terrorists on the ground in Syria, and the knock-on effect, the knock-on positive effect of destroying the terrorists in Syria is that you bring to an end the migrant crisis, which is causing terrible problems for Europe as a whole.
За нашим очень интересным разговором.
We cannot notice that our time flies, because we have a very interesting discussion, and we also have journalists, so I could ask you questions endlessly, but we would suggest that the journalists ask questions to their guests. The second row, International Life, please. Good afternoon. I would like to go back to the topic of the roundtable, reforms in the EU. Mr. Papadopoulos, you have started your presentation by saying that Great Britain is an influential political force in the EU, and the decision to leave or not leave the EU doesn't arise any doubts in independence. Why? Because it is under the influence of the United States that Great Britain really pressured the European countries who were against Russian sanctions, and no one could oppose that. So there are some levels of pressure from the United States on the European Union, and within the European Union there are no levers to resist this. So maybe if Great Britain leaves the European Union, maybe that's favorable to the United States, because the EU is a strategic partner of the Russian Federation for many years. And Russia and the European Union have some strategic mutual plans. So I would like to know what you could answer to that. Before we speak about reforms, maybe there's nothing to reform even.
That's a very intriguing question, a very intriguing observation you've just made, and I agree with it. I'm not so sure that countries such as Germany and France would really not want to see Britain leave the European Union. Britain, in the eyes of many in the European Union, is a troublemaker. Britain lobbies heavily on behalf of the United States in the European Union. Now, economically, the European Union would suffer if Britain left the European Union, but I actually think Britain would suffer more so from an economic perspective if it left. But you know, politically, as you said just now, I don't think Berlin and Paris would be particularly upset to see London leave the European Union, because it would mean that the European Union would be somewhat more flexible in its foreign policy, for example, towards Russia. There wouldn't be that heavy influence, that heavy lobbying on Berlin and Paris from London any longer. But I would say this, on the other hand, the caveat is this, is that Germany is a strategic ally and friend of America. Once communism had collapsed in Eastern Europe, once the Soviet Union had collapsed, America started to retreat somewhat from Europe, and they left Germany to be the unofficial leader of Europe, to run Europe along the lines of what America wanted. And that has persisted to this day. And I think it would be fanciful to believe that if Britain left the European Union overnight, or eventually even, would not pursue an anti-Russian policy, because ultimately Germany is beholden to America and Germany can't get away from America. But I do think that the European Union would be more flexible in its dealings with Russia, for example, if Britain wasn't there. And Britain is a willing junior partner in its special relationship with America. There is no equality in that relationship. How would there be? America is a superpower, Britain is not a superpower. But the British establishment understands that in order for Britain to have some sort of influence on the international stage, in order for Britain to claim that it's one of the big boys, one of the big countries in the world, it has to work with America. It has to have a close association with America, because Britain cannot do things in the world without America. So Britain, to put it colloquially, surfs off the back of America. And so Britain is a junior partner in its relationship with America. It is a willing junior partner in its relationship with America, because that's how Britain can claim, in inverted commas, prestige in the world. But yes, as I said, I think I agree with your observation, and I do believe that politically the European Union would be healthier in terms of its foreign policy without Britain being a member of the European Union, because Britain is America's eyes and ears in the European Union. You could also say that Britain is a Trojan horse for the United States in the European Union. And in regard to the European Union sanctions on on America, on Russia, it was Britain that was leading the charge 2 years ago for sanctions to be placed on Russia. It wasn't Germany. Germany felt very uncomfortable. France felt uncomfortable. Spain, Italy felt uncomfortable. But it was Britain that was pushing for it. It was Britain that was leading the charge. Why? Because of its special relationship with America, But secondly, Britain, ever since it established diplomatic relations with Russia in the 1500s, has long held Russia to be a dangerous country, to being a threat to European civilization, to the security of Europe. And that mindset has continued over centuries. If you compare, when I'm in the House of Commons, in the press gallery where the journalists sit, when I listen to discussions about Russia, do you know, it could be 100 years ago, it could be 150 years ago, it could be a discussion in the House of Commons regarding Russia and the Crimean War. You know, the details, the specific details might have changed. Today it's about Ukraine, but the fundamentals are still there. Britain regards Russia as a malignant country, as not a member of the European family, as not a member of the so-called civilized club in the world. And so I do believe that politically the European Union would be better off without Britain as a member, but don't expect the European Union to break with its strategic relationship with America, because I don't think they want to, but also even if they did want to, they wouldn't be able to get away from America.
Спасибо. Еще вопросы, коллеги?
Thank you very much. Other questions, colleagues? The first row. We have a journalist from Cyprus. You have the floor. My name is Sophokle. I am from Cyprus. I can't imagine how Turkey can be influenced if Turkey is part of this problem. I'm talking about the Syrian problem. And we should not regret about this, about refugees, because Turkey makes money. On the 25th of November, it was decided in the European Union to give 3 billion to Turkey. Now Turkey wants 5 or even 15 billion. And even my small country was forced to pay 2,600,000 to Turkey. Cyprus didn't want to pay that money to Turkey because it doesn't want to pay money to a country which occupies Cyprus, but we still agree to help refugees. And our government has decided to give this money to refugees, Syrian refugees in Lebanon and Jordan. If I may, I will go back to the beginning. I agree that Great Britain is a Trojan horse of the United States within the European Union. I think you said just this, right? Do you think that what Cameron does, what the British leadership does, has been lasted for many years? Those unusual requirements, conditions, and maybe this is a blackmail, maybe this is bluffing in order to win more and more every time compared to other countries who are not as powerful and behind whom there are no United States. Thank you.
Was that for me to comment on? Sorry.
Вопрос
был адресован, да, вопрос был...
Yes, this was a question to London, to you, Marcus.
Apologies. Yeah, do you know, we can take the situation with Cyprus to show how duplicitous Britain's foreign policy is vis-à-vis Turkey. Britain, according to the Cyprus constitution, is one of the guarantors of Cyprus's security. But Britain did nothing to prevent the Turkish invasion of Cyprus in July and August 1974. And Britain, along with America, have a close relationship with Turkey because Turkey is in the neighborhood of Russia, And of course, that enables the Americans and the British to keep a watchful eye on the area where Russia is, but also where the Middle East is. But you know, I say Britain has a duplicitous role towards Turkey. All you need to do is go to central London, is to go to a square called Bedford Square. And on that square, you have an office of the so-called Turkish Republic of Northern Cyprus. The Turkish Republic of Northern Cyprus, the so-called country in the north of the country, in the north of Cyprus, is not recognised by any country around the world apart from Turkey. The Americans and the British, they know they can't recognise it because it would completely be at odds with the United Nations Charter and with international law. But Britain, on the quiet side, supports the so-called Turkish Republic of Northern Cyprus. They have given them the unofficial title of an embassy in London. You go to Bedford Square, there's a building and it's the Turkish Republic of Northern Cyprus. The Turkish Cypriot flag is flying from there. What more does anyone need to argue that Britain has a duplicitous role when it comes to Cyprus? Britain is not, in reality, a guarantor of Cyprus's security. Britain is at one with America. Britain, along with Britain is at one with Turkey. Britain, along with America, has given a blank check to Turkey to do what it wants in the region, to do what it wants in Syria, to do what it wants in northern Cyprus. We don't hear British politicians or British commentators talking about the cultural destruction of the north of Cyprus, how nearly 200,000 Greek Cypriots were ethnically cleansed. We don't talk about how most of the churches in northern Cyprus have either been destroyed by the Turks or turned into mosques. We don't hear about how many Greek Cypriot, Orthodox, Christian cemeteries in the north have been destroyed, how the gravestones have been used to build roads and pavements and roundabouts. Britain, the British government will not highlight that. Why? Because Turkey is one of its closest friends in the world, and they allow Turkey to do as it pleases, because Turkey is where Russia is, it's where the Middle East is, and that's all that matters to Britain. So any talk that Britain is genuinely committed to human rights, the international law, the United Nations Charter, be it in regard to Syria, be it in regard to Libya, or be it in regard to Cyprus, is a total and utter lie. And anyone who really believes that is living in cloud cuckoo land.
Спасибо. Еще вопросы остались?
Thank you. Are there any other questions remaining? Microphone to the second row, please. The newspaper Presidential 80. I will go back to the beginning of our conversation. Should Great Britain stay or leave the EU? And there is one story. During the ice-breaking process, a fisher wanted to pull a boat to the coast, but the boat was carried away by the current. His neighbor saw this, sat on a horse, and started to rush after the boat. On the horse, gathered some people who actually found some ropes. They brought the ropes down from a bridge, and when the boat came to the bridge and the fisher was in that bridge, the fisher was glad. He grasped one rope and he was saved. But one single rope could not have saved the fisher. I understand that if you, as editor-in-chief, wrote about this story in your magazine, maybe that would change the attitude of the British, whether to stay in the EU or to leave the EU. Was that a question? I think you have puzzled our British guest by your question and by your story.
newspapers last year in Britain, national newspapers, they were covering the tragedy of the refugee crisis. And let's say it as it is. It is a tragedy. It's a heartbreaking story. But it still doesn't resonate truly with British people, in particular English people, because the English people in the south of England are very different to the English people in the north. The people in the south of England, they're quite patriotic, more so nationalistic. They regard their true friends in life as being the Americans. They don't regard themselves as being European. They don't regard Britain as being part of Europe. And they might be touched by such tragic stories regarding the refugees, but they think about themselves and they think about their, in my opinion, their deformed outlook in the world. So even if I had run an article on that in my magazine, of course people would think that's sad, but they would turn around and say, well, that's why we don't want to be a part of the European Union, because we can't have that in the English Channel. It's very, very selfish, the mindset of a lot of English people. And, when it comes to me voting in the European Union referendum, it's extremely difficult because I'm completely against the European Union's foreign policy, for example, towards Russia. But at the same time, I believe that Britain benefits economically through being in the European Union. But then the other element is that I think the European Union would be better off without Britain being in there from a political perspective. So there's so many elements involved. It's so complicated. But unfortunately, in Britain, we're not having an intelligent and informed and mature discussion. It really comes down to English nationalism and Britain's close relationship with America, and regarding Europe as being these nasty foreigners who just want to destroy Britain. I mean, that's what it comes down to. I've heard references, as I said earlier, about Napoleon, about the Kaiser, about Nazi Germany. How on earth is that an intelligent discussion? How on earth is that informing the British people in the run-up to the EU referendum? It's not. And that's why I've said it for a long time now, that the state of British politics is actually quite poor. And the British media are actually one of the worst in the world, because they play into this idea that Britain isn't part of Europe. They play into this concept, it's them versus us. Well, no, Britain is a part of the European Union, is a part of Europe. Europe ends at the Ural Mountains. The British people are European people. Whether people in England, in the south of England, like it or not, that's irrelevant. Unfortunately, a lot of the views of people in Middle England, in the south of England, are shared by British politicians, in particular right-wing conservative politicians. So there's no real chance of having an informed and enlightened discussion on whether Britain should remain a member of the EU.
Ну что ж, нам остается лишь дождаться.
Well, we only have to wait for the 23rd of June. Just one small remark regarding the last question and regarding the referendum. Cameron, when he was in Brussels, said, you might like the EU, you might not like it, and he personally doesn't like the EU as it is. But if it's beneficial to the British, then Great Britain should be together with the European Union. And that's the main idea and the main thought which is driving the leadership of Great Britain. So if it's beneficial, then Great Britain should be there. But from the political side, or the political aspect is merging into the background. And if we ask a simple British person what he thinks about the EU, whether he wants to be there or not, of course they know about the EU. They go on vacation to Spain, to Greece, to Cyprus, and many British people use the advantages of free movement. And do you think that free movement will be ended because the Americans also go around the world? Well, this is considered as one of the achievements, this free movement, the achievement of the EU. But the free movement can stay there. Well, it can stay there, but an ordinary British person can actually think that his or her rights can be damaged, that they are not so familiar with this intricate political system. But anyway, while it's economically profitable for Great Britain to be with the EU, it will be there. If there are only economic losses and disadvantages, then they will consider more seriously leaving the EU. Well, we have very free time left, but the question is also whether it's the European Union and the EU members want just Great Britain alone to have those special conditions. Maybe then 27 countries of the EU will have a referendum and will say whether they need a member like Great Britain or not. Well, that's possible, and actually Denmark and Hungary said that at the summit they asked why Great Britain should have a special status, as well as the Czech Republic. They asked, why are we worse? Why the special benefits should only go to Great Britain? But I think that Angela Merkel was able to oppose the main ideas of Cameron. So Merkel and Hollande held their ground. And many experts believe that the concessions that Cameron got from Merkel and Hollande are very tiny, are not significant. Well, let's live and wait to the 23rd of June. Let's wait and see how the British vote, and we will have a good opportunity to invite our distinguished guests once again in order to look in retrospective at this situation and discuss what we came to after the referendum. Thank you very much, Mr. Papadopoulos, for finding the time to talk to Russian journalists and experts. Thank you very much, Nikolai, and see you later.